Obituary of Harpal Brar from 1939 to 2025. Harpal Singh Brar died at 10:10 in the morning Indian time, 4:40 a.m. UK time, on the 25th of January 2025 at 85 years of age. He was at the home of his nephew, Manpreet Singh Badal, in Chandigarh, India. His close comrade and leader of the CPGB-ML, Ella Rule, as well as his daughter Jyoti and sons Ranjit and Carlos, were with him. He leaves us bowed in grief, but we are grateful to have been part of his deeply meaningful life and work. Truly we can say that he shed light on our path, and that the struggle to which he dedicated his life will continue. Harpal was cremated the same evening in his ancestral village and the place of his birth, Fatanwala, near the town of Muxtar, in the state of Punjab. The entire village and many people from surrounding villages and towns attended, as did many members of Harpal's Punjabi family and contacts from his original life. It is hard to think of him as a horse-riding, crop-raising Punjabi farmer, but those were his roots before he journeyed to the metropolis to study for a master's degree in law at University College London, where he would meet and marry his wife, Maisel Kathleen Sharp, become a communist, find his lifelong friends and comrades, and discover his true calling, to work for the liberation of mankind. Harpal was a beautiful human being, loved by those who knew him, and particularly by all who shared his struggle and his cause. He was a passionate, charming, and charismatic man, full of generosity, humour, and joy, with great loyalty and affection for his comrades, friends and family, and a deep love for the working masses. Harpal was a fiery and powerful orator, who both educated and raised the temper of his audience, and hundreds of workers and revolutionaries were drawn to his leadership. His uncompromising and principled positions, his loyalty to the cause of the working and oppressed masses, won him firm friends and comrades. By the same token, these very attributes aroused the hostility of the oppressing class and the reactionary political and academic cheerleaders of empire colonialism and imperialism, as well as their political representatives in the working class movement. Harpal was fearless in speaking out against the Labour Party Social Democrats and reformists, opportunists and Trotskyites, pacifists, anarchists, bourgeois nationalists, including Sikh Punjabi nationalists of the Khalistani movement, and black separatists whose political ideas he criticised, and organisations he exposed as being vehicles for misleading the workers. Following Lenin, Harpal believed and taught us that a revolutionary must be firm in principle, flexible in tactics, and strong enough to swim against the current of accepted, allowable, and fashionable opinion set by the bourgeoisie and its spokesmen. All who stand for the interests of the working class against the powerful apparatus of imperialism must be able to hear the sound of approbation, not in the dulcet sound of praise, but in the roar of irritation. Harpal was self-deprecating about his intellectual abilities and achievements, putting down his great erudition to steady and continual humdrum everyday study and work, but he was undoubtedly exceptionally able and bright, and his journey from rural Punjab to London, the city at the centre of the British Empire, where he threw in his lot with the struggle of the revolutionary proletariat, is a remarkable one. Fatanwala. Harpal was born and raised in colonial India into a Sikh family whose parents were of the landed peasantry. Indeed, he was a direct descendant of Fatan Singh, the village founder, and his ancestors were horse traders and farmers. The India of his birth was ruled by the British Raj, which had systematically bled, in the words of Lord Salisbury, the peoples of the subcontinent to amass great wealth in England, and the English colonists lived in great opulence and parasitic splendour in the decaying days of the empire, behind the civil lines and in their racially exclusive clubs. The British had raised millions of pounds to fund the World War through taxation of the impoverished Indian masses, and levied some 1.3 million soldiers from India, over 1 million of them from Punjab, to fight for the motherland in World War I, and 2.5 million in World War II. Harpal never had any direct contact with the colonial rulers, yet their policy would rend his world. Fatanwala village was at the centre of pre-partition Punjab, close to Lahore, and now just south of the Indian-Pakistan border. There was no systematic schooling of the Indian masses at the time of his birth. The British colonial regime had suppressed pre-existing Punjabi medium schooling, which had been highly advanced in Ranjit Singh's independent and religiously pluralistic Punjabi kingdom, and had not replaced it with any widespread substitute. Being a majority Muslim village, the local primary education was in the madrasa supervised by the village Maulvi, the local Muslim religious scholar and teacher, and it was here that Harpal had his first education, and learned to pen his name in the Punjabi language written in the Arabic script. In 1947, a young Harpal witnessed the cataclysmic partition of India, with its accompanying communal riots and pogroms. At 7 years of age he had not yet learned or understood that this was a plan of the imperial British ruling class, in its decline, and upon quitting India to engender animosity, weakness, and lasting division among the peoples of the subcontinent. He had not learned of the role of Shahid Bhagat Singh in raising a revolutionary movement for the Hindu-Muslim brotherhood, independence and socialism in India, though as an adult he would rediscover this history and write his beautiful work, Inqilab Zindabad, documenting India's freedom struggle. Yet that great historical tragedy that he witnessed had a lasting impact upon him. Perhaps about Harpal, too, we can say, with Marx and Engels, that what the bourgeoisie produces above all else are its own grave-diggers. Harpal's father, Harpal Singh Brar, and his grandfather spent many nights patrolling on horseback with guns in hand to protect their Muslim friends and neighbours from the communal violence that accompanied partition. They honoured their commitment to locate and communicate with their divided friends, and where possible to send resources across the Radcliffe line, the new border brought into being by Lord Mountbatten under the orders of the post-war Labour government of Clement Attlee. Prior to partition, his best friend had been a Muslim boy, from whom he was separated, and the character of his village and life was changed forever. Harpal always considered that the people of India and Pakistan were one people, and were better off united. Indeed, he came to understand that the workers of all countries must unite if we are to rid society of its many injustices, national and religious prejudices. It takes a village to raise a child, and while in the village as a boy, Harpal would play from sun up to sundown in the fields, streets and houses of friends and relatives, eating and laying his head in whichever home he happened to find himself. Being a sociable and inquisitive boy with an incredible memory for detail, Harpal had many stories from his youth, whether witnessing the fights over blood feuds and land disputes fought among the Punjabi peasantry. Even as a child he realized their futility and stupidity, of riding to the local towns on horseback with his grandfather, taming stallions, or running up bills taking friends to Mukhtar's dabas, tea shops, to his father's great annoyance. As a school for an orator, the village was hard to beat, and he derived lifelong strength from the peasantry, its folklore, sayings, jokes, and rustic optimism. He was among the first to see a tractor brought to his village and witness the scepticism of the peasantry turn to amazement and joy as it ploughed more acreage in a day than a team of oxen could previously have ploughed in a week. He witnessed the introduction and motorization of tube wells and the greening and reclamation of semi-arid land. The impact of mechanization and application of technology to agriculture were a matter of practical and lasting significance for him and for us all. Harpal's connection to the peasantry and his childhood experience stayed with him when he would later consider the agricultural revolution in the USSR and learn about collectivization and the socialist solution of the peasant question, holding the key not only to the successful revolutionary struggle of the masses, but to raising productivity, feeding the growing towns and cities, and deliverance from poverty and ignorance of the mass of humanity. Mukhtar. Harpal was sent to board at the Khalsa Sikh religious school in the local town of Mukhtar, founded where the 10th Sikh Guru Gobind Singh had fought his last great battle, and there, despite the odds, and once burning down the dormitory in a game of pistols in which the boys fired phosphorus-tipped matches at each other, he learned Hindi and English and gained a love for the humanities and current affairs. It was the fashion among his peers not to study, but to sleep late, wake late, and do the minimum. But gaining a genuine interest and thirst for knowledge that would last throughout his life, Harpal would wake early and go to the fields with his books and the newspapers, and study before his friends awoke. When his exam results came, and he had excelled in them all, he simply claimed that there must have been a mix-up with exam papers. After secondary school examinations, he gained entry to university in Chandigarh, where he studied English, Punjabi and history, and after gaining his Bachelor of Arts degree, he accepted a place at Delhi University to study for a bachelor's degree in law. Delhi. It was while studying in Delhi that Harpal attended his first political demonstrations, held to protest the assassination by the colonial powers of Belgium, France and the USA of Patrice Lumumba, newly independent Congo's heroic anti-imperialist leader, and in support of the great anti-imperialist struggle of the Vietnamese people and of their leader Ho Chi Minh, who would famously write that nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. These would be the first of hundreds of demonstrations, meetings and actions that Harpal would participate in, speak at and lead. England. Drawn by his inquiring mind and driven by his energetic spirit, Harpal decided that he would travel to England to study for a master's degree in law. He gained entry to London's University College and arrived in the summer of 1962, just prior to the enactment of the UK's first anti-immigration legislation that affected Commonwealth citizens. Harpal always remembered that his first actions were to buy a coat. He found it incredibly cold, and to cut his hair, an act symbolic of moving from a culturally religious upbringing to the materialist outlook of his conscious maturity. In later life, Harpal would never shy away from the discussion of religion with anyone who professed faith, saying that he had seen the most heinous acts carried out in the name of religion, referring to the communalism that the British and the post-colonial ruling classes of the subcontinent used to keep the masses of India and Pakistan in subjection, and against which Harpal was a lifelong campaigner. He recommended Bhagat Singh's Why I Am an Atheist, as well as the dialectical materialist teachings of Marx and his followers. London was a hard city to acclimatise to, climatically and culturally, and at first it was more his pride than any love for the strange and unwelcoming environment that kept him there. Yet little by little he was absorbed into its life, and despite the fact that, as he often said in speeches, immigrants don't come here for the warm reception, the warm weather, or the great food, he was to make his closest personal friends and his most loyal and faithful comrades amongst the British working class. While a student, two things happened to Harpal that changed his life forever, to the consternation of his father, who had wanted him to return to India and marry into a wealthy Punjabi family, but to his and our great benefit. First, he found Lenin in a Luton library. Harpal used to tell us that soon after his arriving from India, before starting his course and while searching for work, he picked up a book and read, by chance, Vladimir Ulyanov Lenin's words. The volume he selected contained Lenin's appeal to a party tribunal before which he had been arraigned by the Mensheviks for issuing a pamphlet against their factional activities and compromises with the reactionaries on the eve of the elections to the Second Duma. Harpal was riveted by the power and incisive logic of Lenin's arguments. So captivating were Lenin's words and thought, so vividly did they imprint themselves upon Harpal with the justice of the Bolshevik cause, that he was compelled to read more. There started a lifelong relationship that led Harpal to embrace revolutionary Marxism-Leninism as the solution to the problems faced by humanity. He would go on to read every word of Lenin's writings and become a firm Leninist and Marxist. It is not without reason that Lenin's writings are no longer stocked in Britain's public libraries. Second, he fell in love with and married a fellow student studying for her bachelor's degree in law, Maisel Kathleen Sharp. Together they became increasingly involved in the anti-imperialist working class and communist movement. They studied and discussed the revolutions of Russia and China, the economics of capitalism and socialism, the works of Marx and Engels, Lenin and Stalin, Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh. In the wake of the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when masses of workers had been shaken by the possibility of nuclear war, yet the triumphant march of humanity towards socialism seemed not only inevitable, but imminent. They immersed themselves in the revolutionary and anti-capitalist struggles among Britain's students and workers. Great October Socialist Revolution. Harpal visited the USSR in 1963 and was greatly impressed with the fruits of Soviet democracy and socialist society. He became a passionate advocate of the Russian and Chinese socialist revolutions and peoples, and the anti-colonial struggles of the Vietnamese people, the South African and Zimbabwean people, the Korean and Palestinian people, and a host of other liberation and anti-colonial movements struggling against British, US, French, Belgian and European imperialism. The struggle of the colonies and neo-colonies for their freedom were inextricably linked with the struggle of the working class for socialism. Workers of all countries unite was the slogan that he accepted and adopted from Marx and Engels, epoch-making work, the Communist Manifesto, and that guided his activity. Harpal became a staunch internationalist, realizing that just as accumulated capital had transcended and overflowed national limits, scouring the globe for workers, resources and markets to exploit, just as peoples of all corners of the globe had been displaced from their native soil by impoverishment, upheaval and colonial war, and drawn to seek their living in the imperialist nations, so the workers must learn to put aside national differences and cooperate together in their common struggle against imperialism. Harpal was inspired by Lenin's words at the Second Congress of the Communist International. Communist parties and groups in the East, in the colonial and backward countries which are so brutally robbed, oppressed and enslaved by the civilized league of predatory nations, were likewise represented at the Congress. The revolutionary movement in the advanced countries would in fact be nothing but a sheer fraud if in their struggle against capital the workers of Europe and America were not closely and completely united with the hundreds upon hundreds of millions of colonial slaves who are oppressed by that capital. Capitalism could not be reformed, he realized. It must be overthrown. Society could only move forward on the basis of a new and higher democracy, a Soviet democracy, that would put the socially operated productive forces, currently individually owned by the billionaire elite, on the firm basis of social ownership, eliminating exploitation and all its accompanying ills. Together, Harpal and Maisel resolved to dedicate their lives to the cause of communism. The Visiparous communist movement in the aftermath of Khrushchev and the Sino-Soviet split. Encountering opposition movements within the students', women's and communist circles and growing denunciations of Stalin amongst the Trotskyites in particular, Harpal and Maisel turned to study these questions for themselves, reading both Stalin and Trotsky, studying the disputed issues, and adjudicating firmly in favour of the revolutionary line of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, and Comintern under the leadership of Joseph Stalin. Harpal and Maisel were active in the anti-imperialist movement in the Britain-Vietnam Solidarity Front, and became increasingly determined to forge an organisation dedicated to freeing humanity of its historical burden of exploitation. Harpal spent an increasing amount of his energy studying the reality of the social, economic and political conditions in Britain and organising to change them for the better. They joined the Revolutionary Marxist-Leninist League, RMLL, led by Abhimanyu Manchanda, a prominent anti-revisionist communist who had been the partner of legendary West Indian American and British communist leader Claudia Jones, the founder of the Notting Hill Carnival and the West Indian Gazette, among other achievements. Harpal and his comrades played a major role in the British anti-Vietnam War movement and led demonstrations in 1968, leading the protesters to the US Embassy in Grosvenor Square, while the Trotskyites of the International Marxist Group, led by Tariq Ali, in fact, tried to lead the protest to disperse harmlessly in Hyde Park. Harpal led the demonstrators to go beyond the pacifist slogan of peace, to call for the victory of the Vietnamese people, who were led in the US-occupied South by the National Liberation Front, and in the North by such legends as Bo Nguyen Giap and Ho Chi Minh. Harpal was marked by the police as a charismatic, persuasive and dangerous speaker, capable of leading the crowd. From that day forward, but never did it stop him organising and living his life to the full. He was never impressed or intimidated by petty police spies, or by the threats and intimidation of his class enemies. Inspired by the triumphant Chinese People's Revolution led by Mao Zedong, and by the strides it was taking to build socialism and combat revisionism, that is, the economic reintroduction of capitalist economics within the USSR that was already well underway by the early 1960s. Harpal and Maisel took a Maoist, anti-revisionist line, and adopted many key positions that Harpal would later expand upon and defend. This experience also reinforced the idea that there could be no revolutionary movement without a revolutionary theory, that study of revolutionary theory was essential to guide the movement, and that without serious ideological leadership, the cause of the liberation of the working class would flounder. We only recently learned that Harpal and Manchanda briefly joined the CPGB-ML, which exists in much diminished form today, and were on its central committee alongside its leader Reg Birch, before deciding that its economism and narrow nationalism were leading it toward oblivion. Falling foul of Manchanda's notorious sectarianism, he and Maisel were expelled from the RMLL, however. Before Manchanda died in 1985, he and Harpal were reconciled and became good friends. Although he agreed with the Chinese Communist Party's critique of Khrushchevite revisionism, Harpal came to realize that the Chinese line, which denounced the Soviet Union as social imperialist, was wrong and harmful, despite the incorrect capitalist roading policies of the USSR. Association of Communist Workers. Harpal and Maisel met their lifelong companions, friends and comrades Iris Slowly and her partner and later husband Godfrey Kremer at a national meeting of the Women's Liberation Movement in 1970, and soon afterwards they met Ella Rule, now chair of the CPGB-ML. These comrades were to become the core of the Anti-Revisionist Association of Communist Workers, ACW. They were active in the movement, arguing against bourgeois feminism and for a revolutionary program of equality for women as part of the working class movement for socialism. They formed the Union of Women for Liberation, vociferously fought the pernicious ideas of Germaine Greer, of Selma James's wages for housework and their ilk, and the ideas that bra burning or kicking the oppressor, men, out of your bed would somehow equate to equality. Their work together forged a bond of loyal comradeship that lasted a lifetime and would form the basis of the work, Marxism and the emancipation of women. They concluded early in the course of their study and activity that the Labour Party was a party of imperialism, a social democratic party, socialist in words, more so then than now, but chauvinist, imperialist, capitalist in its programme and deeds, whether in power or acting as a loyal parliamentary opposition. Because the disintegrating Communist Party of Great Britain, the CPGB, Britain's original Communist Party, established in 1920, was now under the influence of Khrushchevism, firmly revisionist, having turned its back on the need for workers to overthrow the capitalist ruling class's state machine, as taught by Marx, in favour of a parliamentary road to socialism, wedded to a policy of supporting the imperialist Labour Party, these comrades could not join it. In Harpal's own words, what would be the point of joining such a party only to be expelled from it? The CPGB slid all the way to the bottom of this revisionist slope, and in 1991, when the USSR collapsed, its Euro-communist leadership simply declared that the October Revolution was a mistake of historic proportions, and to the disgust of its remaining proletarian members, dissolved itself. Former members of the CPGB had formed the Communist Party of Britain in 1988, as the CPGB leadership was moving too far to the right. The new Communist Party had earlier split from the CPGB when the latter adopted Eurocommunism, criticising the Soviet Union from the right, denouncing its intervention in the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and the 1968 Prague Spring. Nevertheless, both the CPB and NCP parties essentially adopted and maintain to this day the CPGB's revisionist programme of the parliamentary road, which has left them tailing Labour to irrelevance. The ACW campaigned to persuade the leadership of these parties to give up their position of support for the imperialist Labour Party, but both proved incapable of doing so, and could not therefore take the communist movement forward. Hemel Hempstead, Harrow and Southall. Passing the bar exam to become a barrister, Harpal did not choose to practice, but instead taught law, first at Dacorum College in Hemel Hempstead, where he settled with Mazel, and then at Harrow College of Further and Higher Education, which later became part of the University of Westminster. Teaching was merely a means to an end, however, and Harpal's real passion and unflagging energy were reserved for his political work. Harpal demonstrated a clarity of thought and analysis that helped him to guide his comrades, and by degree he became a socialist and communist teacher, a writer, a political theorist, and a practical working-class political leader and organiser. It is a little-known footnote to the history of Hemel Hempstead that Harpal and Mazel were visited by many revolutionaries and communists in their home, among them Robert and Sally Mugabe, in the summer of 1974, then the leaders in exile of the Zimbabwean national liberation struggle against the British colonialists and the Ian Smith Rhodesian apartheid regime. Zimbabwe, African National Union, Patriotic Front was the political leadership of the armed struggle of the black masses for their freedom, and Harpal edited a solidarity journal entitled Revolutionary Zimbabwe for the British Anti-Apartheid Movement, Zimbabwe Solidarity Front, that was distributed to and read by the activists and soldiers of ZANU and ZANLA, Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army. Harpal would later interview Robert Mugabe at several crucial junctures in his negotiations with the British for independence, and when apartheid was overthrown and elections were held after the Lancaster House Agreement, Harpal was invited to attend the independence celebrations in Harare by President Robert Mugabe. Harpal had no money for the plane ticket, but his comrades insisted he attend, and raised the money to send him. Reaching the airport with his invitation and no directions, he hitched a ride on the back of a worker's pickup truck to the presidential palace, and approached the armed guards at the gate, unsure of gaining admission. Diplomatic cars and the great and the good were passing into the compound through the security cordon. When challenged, Harpal presented his invitation, whereupon the armed Zanla soldier of the Presidential Guard took off his machine gun, placed it on the ground, and embraced him as a brother, saying, "Comrade Brar, welcome." Standing in line to be welcomed by the President, he was met with warm, comradely enthusiasm. Sally turned to Robert and said, "Robert, you should hear him speak. He is pure fire." To which Mugabe replied, "I know, I've heard him." A great music concert was held that evening, at which Bob Marley sang his anthem dedicated to the liberation struggle, simply entitled Zimbabwe. Their mass work among British and Indian workers was guided by deep study and writing. Harpal found in Ella, Iris, Godfrey and Mazel great comrades and companions, and Comrade Ella became his closest intellectual collaborator. In many ways, Harpal's work was also Ella's, and vice versa. It was Ella, Godfrey, and Iris who would give him feedback, and who typed the articles that Harpal would always write longhand, with paper and pen. Harpal, in turn, was a constant source of support, advice, and knowledge for them. Indian Workers' Association and Lalkar. Harpal and his comrades of the ACW became actively involved with the Indian Workers' Association, which struggled for the civil rights of Indians and all immigrant workers in Britain. The organisation was a leading voice in the fight against racism, which Harpal rightly perceived to be the Achilles heel of the British working class movement, a mechanism for dividing, weakening, and therefore controlling white as well as black workers. Becoming one of the IWA's leading organisers in Southall, the home of the Punjabi community in Britain, he was also the editor of the IWA's newspaper Lalkar, which he refounded and edited from its first issue in 1979 until his death. Lalkar is a Punjabi, Urdu and Hindi word meaning militant challenge, and also contains the roots of the words lal, meaning red, and kar, meaning work. Though the paper was separated from the IWA as the latter itself wound down its activity, it remains a great source of revolutionary analysis and Marxist teaching, and carried on as an independent anti-imperialist theoretical journal throughout Harpal's life. Under his editorial leadership, Lalkar was a beacon of clarity not only for Indian workers in Britain, but for the progressive British and international working class. Indeed, for the January 2025 issue, Harpal wrote 4 articles and put the paper to the printers before succumbing to his final illness. In the job of writing for, producing and distributing Lalkar, his comrades from the ACW were close collaborators. In a very real sense, they were at the political heart of the Indian Workers' Association and lived and struggled closely with the Indian workers of Britain. His comrades are committed to continuing and augmenting that great legacy. The Indian Workers' Association under Harpal, Jagmohan Joshi, Teja, Sahota, Hardev, Dillon and Avtar Johal's leadership tirelessly and resolutely championed the cause of equality for workers of all national, racial and religious origins. The Independent Workers' Association campaigned both against racist laws and the socially debilitating racism experienced by the black population of Britain on the streets every day, where necessary taking direct action to combat the racist violence they encountered. Struggling against capitalist imperialism, racism, colonialism and apartheid, and for the civil and employment rights of the Indian and British working class, Harpal and his comrades, and a growing group of communists and workers who were drawn to his leadership, tested their ideas and grew in strength and stature. Harpal's anti-colonial and anti-apartheid work led him to work with the South African and Zimbabwean Rhodesian liberation fighters of the ANC and PAC, Umkhonto Wisizwe, Spear of the Nation, ZANU and ZANLA, and he met and spoke with great leaders including Chris Hani and Robert Mugabe, and later our South African communist comrade Kwesi Kadali, whose grandfather had founded the first Native African Union, and whose mother was a communist from the DDR, Socialist East Germany. Great Miners' Strike of 1984–85. In 1984, Harpal led the IWA in a national programme of mass solidarity with the heroic miners' strike. Indian communities across the country took food to the pickets and miners' halls, raised money for the striking miners and their families, and collected toys for their children at Christmas. Harpal spoke at mass meetings of political solidarity with miners, leaders including Arthur Scargill and Malcolm Pitt, and documented the course of that struggle in Lalkar. This concrete solidarity did much to break down the prevailing racism of British society at the time, used then as now to socially control the British working class. The miners had long been considered the militant backbone of the British working class, living in isolated but vital and staunchly working class pit villages across the country, particularly in South Wales, Yorkshire, Kent, Durham and the North East and Scotland. The then Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was determined to break the miners in order to break the unions, casualise labour, close down antiquated factories and heavy industry, shipbuilding and car manufacture, to facilitate the export of capital and the exportation of cheaper labour abroad. Her ideas coincided with those of Reaganism and Milton Friedman's free market fundamentalism, recently practised on the Chilean people. The miners found themselves facing a well-armed and prepared state machine that was ruthless in the suppression of their resistance. Under Arthur Scargill's leadership they came close, so close to victory, but the strike was ultimately sabotaged by a united imperialist front that extended from Labour and the TUC to the Tory government and the entire British state machine, with the fervent propaganda and financial backing of the capitalist press and the City of London financiers. Despite their ultimate defeat, the genuine, heartfelt and spontaneous solidarity of the Indian working class community, as well as Harpal's leading role in promoting it, had a profound and lasting impact on the entire British working class. Harpal, the IWA and our comrades together supported many landmark strikes of organised labour, from Fleet Street, Wapping, to Grunwick and the Hillingdon hospital workers. Anti-racist struggle. Post-war Britain, from the 1950s into the 2000s, was a deeply racist society based on the colonial ideology upon which the British Empire had been built. The IWA struggled for workers' equality, for the civil rights of immigrant and black workers, and against racism in all its forms. As such, Harpal, Godfrey, Ella and Iris were also leading lights of the campaign against racist laws, and leading participants in the mass anti-racist movement, campaigning and organising meetings and demonstrations across the country. Collaboration of the National Front, Labour and the SPG to murder Blair Peach. In 1979, Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan sent police to protect the fascist and white supremacist National Front, which provocatively used the excuse of a general election that brought Thatcher to power to hold a racist rally among the Indian workers of Southall. Harpal and the IWA organised a mass anti-racist march to protest and kick the fascists out. Thousands of police, including members of the notorious Special Patrol Group, were sent by the Labour government to beat the anti-racist and Indian protesters off the streets. Scores were arrested that day, including Harpal. A young New Zealand-born teacher, Blair Peach, was beaten to death by the SPG. It later transpired that the SPG thugs had doctored their truncheons illegally, boring them out and filling them with lead to make them lethal. The cracking of Blair Peach's skull was therefore an act of premeditated murder. The SPG was wound up only to be replaced by the similarly thuggish and brutal Territorial Support Group, the TSG, and predictably no police assassin was held accountable for his crimes. Stephen Lawrence. Nearly 15 years later, the IWA jointly organised a huge anti-fascist, anti-BNP march in Welling in 1993, after a string of racist murders had taken place in the area. These included that of Stephen Lawrence, a young black teenage boy, by a group of 4 fascist-minded youths with links to the Fascist National Front and British National Party. An enormous police presence was again put onto the streets to protect the fascists' bookshop, from which the local racists coordinated their activities. In a predictable pattern, the Metropolitan Police violently attacked the protesters, while the press made national propaganda that turned truth upside down, depicting the police as innocent victims of the aggression of the anti-racist demonstrators. Harpal addressed the crowd that day on behalf of the IWA, giving them their slogan, "We are black, we are white, together we are dynamite." In 1962, IWA chairman Avtar Johal, a foundry worker, union leader who would become a close comrade of Harpal's, invited Malcolm X to visit Birmingham, the scene of racial violence. Smethwick was a site of both East Indian and West Indian immigration after World War II. As with other immigrant communities, including Southall, migration was encouraged and initiated by local industry, which was in need of labour, and brought workers and after them their families from Britain's former colonies. The workers of Smethwick, as elsewhere in Britain, had long been subject to the racist imperial propaganda pushed by the British Empire. Local Labour MP and later British Union of Fascists leader and MP Oswald Mosley had been replaced by the equally racist and repugnant Conservative MP Peter Griffiths, whose election slogan had infamously been, "If you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Labour." Griffiths supported a programme of social segregation in Britain, under which the Smethwick Conservative Council bought up houses and offered them for rental to whites only. Racial prejudice was a constant blight, said Comrade Avtar, and the IWA devoted its energies to demonstrating that racism is a product of capitalism, and that the workers, no matter where they came from, shared common interests. The IWA campaigned against casteism, communalism, and separatism, for women's equality and against dowry and arranged marriage, and it particularly took up the anti-colonial and anti-racist struggle of the South African masses struggling against the settler colonial apartheid regime, as well as the equally vital cause of the liberation struggle of the Palestinian people, fighting to rid themselves of the yoke of the settler colonial apartheid regime of Israeli Zionism. Both regimes were, of course, backed to the hilt by their motherland, by British imperialism. Fighting the corruption of the local Labour Party in Southall led Harpal to contest local elections in which he was narrowly defeated, owing to the combined forces of Labour and its hangers-on. Harpal and his comrades organised and he spoke at huge anti-apartheid and pro-Palestine rallies throughout the 1980s and 1990s. It was in this connection that Harpal made national speaking tours with Gora Ibrahim of the South African PAC, Pan-African Congress, and met Chris Hani, South African communist and ANC youth leader, shortly before his assassination. He also journeyed to meet the Palestinian Liberation Organization's PLO leader Yasser Arafat in Tunisia in 1986. Among Harpal's many writings were Zionism, a racist, reactionary and anti-Semitic tool of imperialism, and Imperialism in the Middle East, co-authored with Ella Rule, with specific reference to the liberation struggle of the Palestinian people, which summarised the historical origins of Zionism as a British settler colonial project to rule the Middle East colonies acquired by Britain by dint of World War I and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the secret treaties published by Lenin and the Bolsheviks after the 1917 October Revolution in Russia. The former book has since acquired a political life of its own. Both deserve to be read and studied today in the aftermath of the Israeli genocide of 2023 to 25, which constitutes both a second Nakba and a heroic continuation of the liberation struggle of the peoples of the Middle East. Irish liberation. Throughout the period of the armed struggle in the occupied 6 countries of Northern Ireland, Harpal and the IWA organised regularly in solidarity with the national liberation struggle of the Irish people and hosted meetings with Gerry Adams and other Republican leaders at a time when it was illegal for them to speak or for their voices to be heard on terrestrial television across Britain. Marx famously wrote that no nation that enslaves another can itself be free. This has been especially true of the relationship between British and Irish workers, and Harpal and his comrades were firm supporters of a united Ireland consisting of all its 32 countries. Marx observed in 1870 that every industrial and commercial centre in England now possesses a working class divided into 2 hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a member of the ruling nation, and consequently he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. He cherishes religious, social and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him is much the same as that of the poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the USA. The Irishman pays him back with interest in his own money. He sees in the English worker both the accomplice and the stupid tool of the English rulers in Ireland. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means of the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class. Despite its organisation, it is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this. With Elon Musk's grotesque tweets about immigration, Pakistani grooming gangs, white genocide, etc., and with the entire government and parliamentary opposition, Labour, Tory, Liberal and Reform, and the entire capitalist press following his lead, we can see that these issues are far from finished with. As the capitalist crisis grows, racism and religious prejudice remains the principal ugly devices used by the British ruling class to stoke division and perpetuate their senile rule. The oppression of Ireland by the British predated but mirrored India's experience of the brutal and racist regime of the Raj, and their liberation struggles had long looked to and nurtured one another. The IWA, in fact, had claimed Shahid Udham Singh as an early member, and he had become a staunch revolutionary with links to the Comintern, the Republican movement and the IRA. Gerry Adams came to speak to meetings of Indian workers in Southall during the time of the Troubles. Under Harpal's guidance, Indian and British workers discarded the chauvinist propaganda then omnipresent in the British press and in society and made common cause with their Irish brothers and sisters. This solidarity was a welcome breath of fresh air for our Irish comrades at a time when the words of Adams were routinely suppressed and his voice was dubbed and censored in British radio and television news bulletins. before the advent of cable TV and the latter ubiquitous ZTV and Sunrise Radio, when there was no easy access to Indian language, news or culture in Britain, and when the first generations were struggling to build their lives here, the IWA was a genuine mass community and cultural organisation which also politicised a generation of Indian workers to play a positive and progressive role in British working class life. Saklatvala Hall. As a national leader of the Indian Workers' Association of Great Britain and a leading member of the working class and Indian community, Harpal was a universally known leader and personality in Southall. It was for this reason that he and his comrades of the ACW built a community centre, and now the CPGB-ML's headquarters, Saklatvala Hall in Southall, named after the great communist and MP for Battersea, Shapurji Saklatvala. The hall was inaugurated with a meeting in December 1999, attended by Saklatlava's daughter Seri and presided over by Harpal, with the other principal guest speaker being Arthur Scargill. The Great Test of 1990 to 91. The fall of the USSR, an era of the blackest reaction. The Russian Revolution of October 1917 was a beacon of hope for the workers of all countries. Lenin wrote that the workers of the whole world, no matter in what country they live, greet us, sympathize with us, applaud us for breaking the iron ring of imperialist ties, of sordid imperialist treaties, of imperialist chains, for breaking through to freedom and making the heaviest sacrifices in doing so. For, as a socialist republic, although torn and plundered by the imperialists, keeping out of the imperialist war and raising the banner of peace, the banner of socialism for the whole world to see. The USSR and Comrade Stalin, in defeating the Nazi German imperialists and bringing communism from the realms of theory to the world of practical realities, had made the workers of the world a power. Harpal wrote extensively on the significance of the victories of the USSR and to the impetus it gave to the freedom and anti-colonial struggles of the world's peoples. Noted that Stalin had echoed Lenin's sentiments, and in opposition to Trotsky, who continually campaigned against the building of socialism in the USSR, had defended it as being at the centre of the world revolution. What would happen if capital succeeded in smashing the Republic of Soviets? There would set in an era of the blackest reaction in all the capitalist and colonial countries. The working class and the oppressed peoples would be seized by the throat, the positions of international communism would be lost. In the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, when renegacy became the fashion, Stalin's words were most tragically borne out. Guided by his deep study and understanding of Marxism-Leninism, Harpal stayed true to his principles, to the conviction that the working class is the ruling class in waiting, and that a socialist and communist society can be built in Britain and the world for the greatest benefit, indeed, the salvation of mankind. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. It was Harpal's great misfortune to live at a time of great reverses for the communist movement, but it was to our great benefit that we had Harpal to take up the difficult cause of defending the liberation ideology of the working masses at such a dark time. to navigate the rapids of revolution and the reverses of counter-revolution, to see the course of working-class liberation despite the zigzags of history, when so many others were shaken by these reverses, Harpal turned once more to a deep political and theoretical study and analysis. It is not difficult to be a revolutionary when revolution has already broken out and is in spate, when all people are joining the revolution just because they are carried away, because it is the vogue, and sometimes even from careerist motives. After its victory, the proletariat has to make most strenuous efforts, even the most painful, so as to liberate itself from such pseudo-revolutionaries. It is far more difficult and far more precious to be a revolutionary when the conditions for direct, open, really mass and really revolutionary struggle do not yet exist. To be able to champion the interests of the revolution by propaganda, agitation and organisation in non-revolutionary bodies, and quite often in downright reactionary bodies, in a non-revolutionary situation, among the masses who are incapable of immediately appreciating the need for revolutionary methods of action. To be able to seek, find and correctly determine the specific path or the particular turn of events that will lead the masses to the real, decisive and final revolutionary struggle, such is the main objective of communism in Western Europe and in America today. Perestroika. It was in these circumstances that Harpal published his first book, Perestroika, The Complete Collapse of Revisionism. The profound analysis of an epoch-shaping event, which Harpal assumed that, like him, everyone understood, was written at the insistence of his comrades as a series of Lalkar articles in 1990. Having studied the evolving restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union, the splits that resulted from this revisionism, the secret speech that Khrushchev made to the 20th Party Congress of the CPSUB in 1956, the economic debates within the USSR, and, of course, Stalin's last great work, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, Harpal understood the restoration of capitalism as it was happening. Many others did not, and were stunned at the apparent defeat of communism, loudly proclaimed to be the end of history by the triumphant imperialist bourgeoisie and their ideologues, notably Francis Fukuyama. Harpal explained to the IWA and the wider socialist movement, in this short but brilliant work, the economic and ideological causes of the dissolution of the Soviet socialism, and therefore the lessons to be learned from this historical calamity. Many other movements and parties have failed to learn this historical lesson till this day, and many are therefore unable to move on with the work of building a revolutionary movement. Harpal remained to the last a firm adherent of Marx and Engels, of Lenin and of Stalin. Stalin Society. It was in these conditions that Harpal brought together the leading British anti-revisionist communists such as Bill Bland, Kamal Majid, Ivor Kenner and Wilf Dixon, who wished to keep alive the communist movement and work towards the foundation of a genuinely revolutionary communist party in Britain, under the banner of the Stalin Society, which did not escape the attention nor the derision of the bourgeois press, but he nonetheless carried this vital mission forward. The society was formed in 1991 to defend Stalin and his work on the basis of fact and to refute the capitalist, revisionist, opportunist and Trotskyist propaganda directed against him. Stalin's name is synonymous with communism, the October Revolution, and the overthrow of capitalist exploitation and imperialist tyranny. For this reason, the international bourgeoisie have spearheaded their attacks on working and oppressed peoples by slandering Stalin and the Soviet Union. They have employed a variety of tactics to this end over the last century, but have been guided to a large extent by dissidents who betrayed the Soviet people, most notably Leon Trotsky. The powerful US-based Hearst press, sympathetic to Hitler, was a pioneer in these methods, but the rest of the capitalist world's media and political elites have not lagged behind. The activity of the Stalin Society included the study of and research upon Stalin's writings and actions, the translation of material into and from other languages, the publication of material relating to such study and research, the celebration and commemoration of important occasions in Stalin's life, the establishment of contact with other groups and individuals with a view to taking a common stand on issues and the joint organisation of future activities, and the establishment of contact with similar societies and groups abroad with a view to mutual benefit from experience and collaboration. The brilliant output of the Stalin Society over a 30-year period did much to cement and preserve the revolutionary teachings of Marxism-Leninism and give a firm theoretical grounding to the core workers of both the Socialist Labour Party, after it was formed in 1996, and the CPGB-ML from 2004 onwards. During this time, Harpal published his seminal works on Trotskyism or Leninism, on imperialism, and on Labour Party social democracy, and he brought together work on the women's movement, the anti-imperialist struggles of the Indian, Palestinian, and Zimbabwean peoples, and a criticism of imperialism's many post-colonial and post-Soviet wars. Socialist Labour Party 1997 to 2004. As Tony Blair was coming to power, he led the Labour Party in abolishing Clause 4 of the party's constitution, which had promised, falsely, to bring about nationalisation of the means of production, distribution and exchange in Britain. When the miners' leader, Arthur Scargill, formed the Socialist Labour Party, the SLP, in 1996, as a response to this betrayal, Harpal greeted its foundation as a break between the working class of Britain and social democracy, the Labour Party, which he saw as the chief social prop of the British capitalists amongst the working class. He understood that Clause 4 was never intended to be implemented, and that the Labour Party was always and everywhere a false friend to the British workers, the enemy within. It was his firm view that British workers could make no progress without combating and destroying the Labour Party's hold over the socialist and trade union movement and wider working class. In 1997, Scargill invited Harpal and his comrades to join his newly formed party and asked Harpal to stand as a candidate in the general election. The ACW, which had recently merged with the Association of Indian Communists to become the short-lived Association of Communists, GB, known as ACGB, decided to throw in its lot with the SLP and dissolve itself, and Harpal went on to become one of the party's key leaders, standing for election in Southall in 1997 and again in 2003. Harpal dedicated himself to fighting to build the SLP into a militant working-class party with a Marxist understanding and political vision, and he used his position as Education Secretary to set up party schools and try to win over as many members as possible to his ideas. Notably, he persuaded the December 1997 Congress to abandon the party's black section, championed by the SLP's Trotskyite faction, as being divisive and insulting to black workers. Harpal was among the first to recognise the poison of black nationalism and separatism within the working class movement, and as a leader of the IWA, had written and campaigned against it consistently. His numerous articles on the subject were collected into the book Bourgeois Nationalism or Proletarian Internationalism, which was an early contribution to the struggle against the emerging anti-Marxist politics of identity. Harpal always held that it was not the sole concern of the black workers to fight racism, since racism was the Achilles heel affecting the whole of the working class movement, the secret by which the capitalist ruling class holds sway over a considerable section of the white working class. As such, it was the job of all workers to fight it. "I'm not a black communist," he said. "I am a communist who also happens to be black." When it became clear that despite the best efforts of Harpal and his supporters, the SLP could not move beyond Arthur's vision of old Labour and a reformed capitalism, Harpal and his comrades were forced to leave that project, as the mass expulsion of the Yorkshire section of the party and half of the leadership, NEC, on spurious grounds made clear. Matters came to a head when the SLP Congress in 2003 passed a resolution, opposed by Arthur Scargill, defending the right of the DPRK to have a nuclear deterrent, the argument in favour of the motion having been put by Harpal and his comrades, who had been working in support of the DPRK for very many years. Very shortly afterwards, Arthur organised the expulsions, but the time spent with comrades of the SLP had not been in vain. This was the organisational impetus necessary for the founding of Britain's first truly revolutionary party since 1951, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. Anti-war and anti-imperialist campaigning. Stop the war. While inside the SLP, Harpal and his comrades played a leading role in opposing the new wave of post-Soviet colonial wars, starting with NATO's brutal bombardment and dismemberment of Yugoslavia in 1999, and the illegal imprisonment, trial and custodial torture and extrajudicial murder of its leader, Slobodan Milosevic. Comrades took part in the colossal 2 million man march against the Second Iraq War in February of 2003 and were an integral part of the Stop the War campaign. After the formation of the CPGB-ML, it affiliated to Stop the War. Of course, it was never invited to join Stop the War's leadership body or to send a speaker to any of its platforms. Such was the hostile sectarianism of the revisionists and Trotskyites who led the anti-war movement into the lap of the Labour Party, the very party that, in or out of office, never lagged behind the Conservatives in promoting, supporting and financing the wars. Despite this, the party persuaded the delegates at Stop the War's National Conference to adopt its resolution on non-cooperation with imperialist war crimes, but was unable to get Stop the War to act upon this resolution, which they quietly pigeonholed. The coalition, badly misled by such left Labour luminaries as Tony Benn, Jeremy Corbyn et al., tolerated the CPGB-ML's presence in their ranks until they found an excuse to expel it in 2011 over the issue of Libya. As that war was in preparation and the bourgeois media were ramping up their hysterical propaganda against Libya's revolutionary leader Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, the Stop the War leadership of John Rees, Lindsay German, Chris Nynam and Andrew Murray et al. Went so far as to organise a demonstration outside the Libyan embassy in London, denouncing Colonel Gaddafi as a dictator. They were joined by the Wahhabist foot soldiers of imperialism in a disgusting display of pro-NATO pro-imperialist civility to the ruling class. The CPGB-ML denounced this pro-war activity and line of the stop-the-war Trotskyites and revisionists and was promptly and unconstitutionally expelled for criticising its leadership. When the party tried to appeal to the next annual conference against this disgusting act, its comrades were refused permission to speak, shouted down and ejected by none other than the great white hope of the fake left, Jeremy Corbyn. The party, of course, continued its anti-war work outside that bankrupt organisation. It is an enduring credit both to Harpal's proletarian internationalism, his anti-imperialism and his personal courage that he journeyed both to Iraq, ahead of the Labour onslaught in 2003, and to Libya in 2011, together with Ella Rule and his Somali and Belgian comrade Mohammed Hassan, then in the Workers' Party of Belgium. He went to Tripoli to deliver a message of solidarity to the Libyan people, even as the destruction of that proud, independent and developed North African country was underway by the neo-Nazi NATO Luftwaffe cowardly aerial bombardment. These actions earned him the derision of the left imperialists in our Stop the War and Trotskyite movement, eager as ever to prove themselves useful tools to the Labour Party and the British ruling class. But his proud and courageous solidarity has stood the test of time, and we are grateful for his leadership and loyalty to the cause of the oppressed. Without adopting this approach, the British workers will never see socialism. China. Harpal and his comrades responded to the many attacks on Communist China with solidarity and support. In particular, they founded the Hands Off China campaign when the attacks crescendoed in the lead-up to the Beijing Olympics in 2008. When the CPGB-ML's 7th Party Congress charged Harpal to write a book on China, explaining socialism with Chinese characteristics, Harpal once more took up a serious study of China's economic and political conditions, and wrote what is a definitive analysis and remains obligatory reading for communists. Revolutionary seizure of the land in Zimbabwe in 2000. In 2000, Labour Minister of State Development, in effect the Colonial Secretary of British Imperialism, Claire Short, finally and officially reneged on the UK's commitment to finance the buyback of Zimbabwe's colonial lands, seized by their colonists from the indigenous black population. A second wave of struggle arose in Zimbabwe, with the veterans of the armed struggle moving to seize lands without compensation, and after some hesitation, this was formally legalised by Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF government. The howls of the US and UK imperialism were loud, and the sanctions pressure from global capital and propaganda war from global media, BBC foremost among them, were intense. The threat to their property rights and ongoing exploitation of the African masses and natural resources were clear. In 2004, while a leader of the SLP, Harpal brought his work on Zimbabwe together with his book Zimbabwe Chimurenga, from the Shona slogan Pamberi na Chimurenga, meaning victory to the liberation struggle. It was a tribute to the heroic and victorious struggle of the Zimbabwean masses under the leadership of ZANU-PF, and also a powerful polemic in justification of the confiscation of the land without compensation and its division among the peasantry. In 2005, Harpal was invited to attend and speak at the ZANU-PF Congress to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the liberation of Zimbabwe, and he gladly returned to the warm embrace of the Zimbabwean comrades who in the 1970s, when they struggled together, would weave Harpal and his comrades' names into their Shona liberation songs. Harpal spoke to the full plenary session shortly after meeting and greeting Robert Mugabe after a 25-year hiatus that had seen them step on such very different paths, one as a national leader, the other as an ongoing revolutionary foot soldier in the belly of the imperialist beast. Harpal's contribution electrified the audience. In a speech that was televised nationally, Harpal recalled that the people of Zimbabwe had won their independence with guns in hand, after a fierce and protracted struggle in which they had made great sacrifices, and that they had not done so to remain servants in their own land. They had done so to gain control of the natural mineral resources and the land of their country. Britain had not kept its side of the bargain, and the only way to settle the historical injustices of colonial robbery and bloodshed, and of apartheid and racism, in the absence of these promised reparations of £1 billion from Britain, was the revolutionary seizure of the land. Be it noted in passing that it is typical that a Labour government would be at the heart of a policy more dishonourable and reactionary than the Tory government of Margaret Thatcher. The seizure of Zimbabwe's land from the white farmers, without compensation, and its division among the peasantry was, moreover, the greatest revolutionary democratic act since the seizure of the feudal estates of France by the great French Revolution of 1789. Britain and the USA were not only worried about Zimbabwe, they were then, as they are now, anxious to preserve the iniquitous monopolization of the land throughout Africa and their former colonial, now neo-colonial, possessions. In particular, they worried about the example set by the Zimbabwean masses and ZANU-PF to the South African masses and the ANC. They were also outraged by the arrest of Mark Thatcher for his colonial escapades in Equatorial Guinea and for flouting the laws of Zimbabwe. They were further angered by the revolutionary assistance offered to the Democratic Republic of Congo's independent government of Laurent Kabila. With these steps, Africa had moved away from the era of colonial domination and humiliation and taken a giant step in the direction of truce and lasting economic and political liberation and dignity. Pamberi na Chimurenga, a luta continua. Once he started speaking, Harpal pleaded with the assembled delegates that he should not be interrupted by the loud and stormy applause he was receiving, as he only had 15 minutes to speak. Whereupon Comrade Mugabe stood and insisted that there is no time limit for Comrade Brar. And when Harpal had finished speaking, amid thunderous applause, Mugabe held aloft the copy of the book Zimbabwe Chimurenga that Harpal had gifted him, and he'd been thumbing, and said, "I know, Comrade Brar, we worked together during the liberation struggle, but lost contact. It is good to be back in touch. We have not written the history of our own liberation struggle, but this book contains that history. You must all get a copy and read it." The Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. It has always been Harpal and his comrades' wish to refound the communist movement of Britain on a solid Marxist and Leninist basis. For without organisation and revolutionary leadership, as their entire life struggle and work had shown, the working class has nothing. In its struggle for power, the proletariat has no other weapon but organisation. Disunited by the rule of anarchic competition in the bourgeois world, ground down by forced labour for capital, constantly thrust back to lower depths of utter destitution, savagery and degeneration, the proletariat can, and inevitably will, become an invincible force only through its ideological unification on the principles of Marxism being reinforced by the material unity of organisation which welds millions of toilers into an army of the working class. One Step Forward, Two Steps Back by Lenin, 1904. The details and reasons for formation were well documented at this time of the First Party Congress held on Saturday the 3rd July 2004 in Clava Hall, Southall. The party programme and rules were written by Harpal and adopted unanimously, enshrining the key lessons both of the struggle to build the SLP and of the great teaching of Leninism as adapted to suit the conditions of Britain. In the 20 years of its history, Harpal was the guiding force of the CPGB-ML, guiding and teaching the membership, initially as founding party chairman until its 8th Congress when he stepped down because of his advanced years. However, he remained a highly active member of the Central Committee for the rest of his life and died a proud Communist Party member. Harpal was undoubtedly a great disciple of Marx and Lenin, recognizing that the great socialist October Revolution in Russia was a watershed of cultural enlightenment and freedom for humanity. Harpal's critique of Trotskyism, his defense of the revolutionary teaching and leadership of Joseph Stalin, and his critique of the Khrushchevism and revisionism that caused the downfall of Soviet socialism are among the lasting theoretical contributions he bequeathed to the communist movement. The long, tumultuous, and at times arduous struggle of the CPGB-ML aims to carve out a place in the political life of Britain, to reclaim a revolutionary tradition and trajectory for the British working class, to reclaim the birthright of the proletariat as the ruling class in waiting, and end the shameful period of its abject servitude and forced wage slavery for capital. Fully supported by Lalkar and Harpal Brar, its editor, the party has had to deal with all the questions that dog the British and world proletariat, all the subtle and crass means by which the proletariat is held in subjection as a class. Its Congress resolutions and the output of its paper, Proletarian, its website, meetings, video communications, and its publication house, its leaflets, pamphlets, and books have reflected this journey, and Harpal's immortal contribution is reflected across all of these great and enduring gifts to the proletariat and to mankind. Lalkar and the CPGB-ML have dealt with the correct approaches to immigration and racism, Scottish nationalism and independence, identity politics and black separatism versus proletarian internationalism and working class solidarity. They have dealt with the issues of bourgeois feminism versus women's liberation as a part of the struggle for socialism. They have considered the impact of the latest transgender trend and the divisive influence of identity politics. They have tirelessly campaigned to expose the Labour Party and reduce its hold on the British working class. They have analysed and exposed British imperialism and the effect that this has on the British working class movement. They have campaigned ceaselessly for the support and victory of the Palestinian liberation struggle and the ejection of Anglo-American and EU imperialism from the whole of the Middle East. They have campaigned for the defeat of Britain's imperialist Tory and Labour governments and parties and exposed their dirty colonial wars in Iraq, Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, etc. They have brought solidarity to the peoples of the socialist world, forging close links with the Cuban people and the Communist Party of Cuba and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and its leadership in the Workers' Party of Korea. Internationalism. While Harpal was born in India, he was a true Briton and a great leader of the British working class. Throughout all of his work and struggle among the British workers, he never forgot that proletarian internationalism was the only weapon that can secure lasting victory over capital, and he took a keen interest in fostering links with the communist movement in all countries. For many years, the Belgian Workers' Party, under the leadership of Ludo Martens, was a close fraternal organisation. It was Harpal who encouraged Ludo to give up the self-applied label of Maoist and rather consider himself a Marxist-Leninist. Reading Ludo's books on Another View of Stalin and the Velvet Counter-Revolution, Harpal appreciated Ludo's intellect and contribution, while being able to give gentle criticism of the points where Ludo had made undue concessions to the narrative of the imperialists, particularly in regard to the trope that Stalin made mistakes that are never specified, ensuring there is no possibility of ascertaining whether it is Stalin or his critics who are mistaken. Ludo accepted the criticism. Ludo had enormous respect for Harpal, and they had a close friendship until his dying day. Ludo felt keenly his responsibility toward the liberation struggle in the Congo, and the PTB suffered badly when Ludo relocated to Kinshasa. When he returned, he suffered a stroke, and Harpal, Ella and Ranjit visited him in Belgium just prior to his death, when, despite his ill health, he was able to express regret for the turn his party had taken towards social democracy and away from Marxism-Leninism. For a time, the PTB's annual 1st of May event and the international seminar the PTB organised in Brussels was a focus of the revolutionary communist movement, struggling to come to terms with the fall of the USSR and the collapse of the Eastern European people's democracies. From this forum, Harpal made contact with revolutionary communist groups and parties from across Europe, the Americas, and further afield, including the reformed communist parties within the USSR. He frequently gave presentations regarding the USSR, imperialism, and many aspects of current revolutionary work and struggle. Many of Harpal's papers, speeches, articles, books and pamphlets have been translated by these comrades and parties into diverse languages including French, Flemish, German, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, as well as Korean, Hindi and Punjabi, Urdu, Arabic, Russian, Hungarian, Czech, and others. Indeed, while writing this obituary, we have heard news that our comrades in Union Proletariat Spain are finishing their work of translating and producing Harpal's now famous pamphlet on Zionism, a racist, reactionary, and anti-Semitic tool of imperialism. The recent founding of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform declares its ideological debt to Harpal's work and teaching. His daughter, Jyoti, has been central to much of its work, together with many international comrades. Harpal went to lay flowers on Stalin's grave on the anniversary of the Great October Revolution and spoke in Red Square at the wall of the Kremlin to a great demonstration on November 7, 1997. He noted that many Red Army men listened attentively to the translation of his speech, which concluded with the words that in the great land of Lenin, socialism will come, if not in my lifetime, then in yours. The USSR will undoubtedly be born again, and in the words of the great Russian playwright Chernyshevsky, there will be joy and laughter in our streets. Harpal has preserved and applied the great teachings and liberation ideology of Marxism to the communist movement and the modern conditions of Britain. He has lived a remarkable and productive life. His legacy lives on in his work, his books and articles, his extensive collection of recorded speeches and presentations, and by the new generations of British communist workers who are swelling the ranks of the CPGB-ML and the progressive movement. If Harpal could say one thing to us, it would be to guard the party as you guard the apple of your eye. He struggled to found and build it in the most difficult conjunction of circumstances, after the fall of the once mighty USSR. It is his life's work, and he gave to it his whole being. It is a great gift that he leaves us, the best of Britain. His work is relevant to communists worldwide for shedding light on the situations of India, of the Soviet Union and China, and of the working-class revolutionary culture of all nations. Harpal was a true proletarian internationalist. Harpal thought creatively about how to solve the problem of uniting revolutionary politics with the mass of the British workers. To that end he worked with, met, discussed and collaborated with the greatest revolutionaries and British working-class leaders of his time, among them Manchanda Ludo, Martins, Robert Mugabe, our Cuban, Korean and Chinese comrades, down to Avtar Johal, Jagmohan Yoshi, Arthur Scargill, Frank Cave and Bob Crow. But the greatest and most self-sacrificing comrades, and his true friends and comrades, were always those unsung heroes. Maisel, who latterly uses the name Cathy Sharp in connection with her political work, Godfrey Kremer, Iris Slowly, Ella Rule, Deborah Lavin, Isabel Crook, Jack Shapiro, and many others. With Lenin, Harpal realized that without a revolutionary theory there can be no revolutionary movement. That was the slogan he inscribed on the banner of Lalkar, and it's Lenin's insightful way of paraphrasing Marx. There is no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. For Harpal, study was a practical part of politics. Without it, no party can ever succeed in effectively leading the working people to bring an end to their current state of servitude, their wage slavery. This was an early realization of Harpal's, and his work, together with that of the CPGB-ML, of which he was the greatest founding member, is the enduring legacy that he leaves us. A luta continua.